So I had some questions that I just sort of came to me while I was reading through like documents and sort of putting all this together. So they're not in any logical order. So I just was hoping to ask some. I think there's 7. And so if that's okay with everyone. And I hope none of them are dumb questions. But let me know. And so first off, I noticed obviously that most of the letters and the correspondence seem more concerned about like the joint or the collective ordination rather than like women ordination or like lesbian ordination. Was that, do you think that was actually the case, or was that just sort of like the scapegoat for you know, trying to put up any resistance?
Well, I would just say it had never been done before, right, Loey? It had never been done.
Right.
It had never been done, and what we made a conscientious choice after hours of conversation and discernment, and especially talking with Bill Icorn about should we be out as lesbians in the ordination process. We're in the same association that had ordained Bill Johnson 6 years earlier. So a gay lesbian ordination was not that unusual, and we were out as individuals. I mean, at that time, I mean, Jody, you can name however you identify yourself, but at that time, Jody and I were partners. And you identified as a lesbian at that time. Stacy certainly did. I certainly did. The church knew that we were lesbian. We actually came out to the whole congregation in the process of our ordination so that in case this blew up somehow, because Stacy was getting pushback from people in the conference because she had been called to a conference position working with youth and young adults. Mm-hmm. And if that was going to be a big blow up, we wanted to make sure the congregation was behind us. And they voted unanimously, as far as we know, to say, yes, we still continue to support you. The push was we wrote our ordination paper together, and nobody had ever done that before. You know, we shared our individual faith journeys, but then we wrote our theology of ordination and ministry together, and we requested to be examined together, not separately. And we felt that that was going to be cutting edge enough that to add the sexuality piece to the whole thing might have been too much. Mm. You know, years later, we hear from people who were on that committee on ministry and in the process close to it that they all knew we were lesbian. They were behaving themselves and not saying anything about it because they had learned sexuality is not a, you know, pro or con ordination. They did their job well. And then but they also said, God, it probably would have been a real relief if you had come out because, you know, then it could have just been there because essentially everybody already knew. Is that your, Stacy and Jody, is that your recollection?
Yep.
Yeah, mine too. I think that what was interesting about the committee and the ministry is that what was so difficult for, I mean, in the traditional ordination process, it's individual to God, right? So there's this whole calling of the individual to a higher power, and they were just completely befuddled about what to do with 3. I mean, they couldn't figure, they didn't know who wrote this part of the ordination paper, and we would respond with, we wrote it together. That is the point. We collaborated. I mean, they struggled and struggled. We went back. How many times did we go back before them?
Oh, God, I don't know.
It was at least 3, and yeah. It was such and you know, I mean, they say that they would have preferred we come out, but I don't know. I mean, I often wonder, I think some of the pushback was because of the process and the calling thing. I think the other one could have been that we were 3 lesbians, and that had to be functioning at some level because things aren't, you know, were not as, shall we say, moving forward in that way as quickly as they are now. So So yeah, so I think there were numbers of things going on, and because of it, they had a hard time with us. That's for sure. Jody, does that ring with you?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I do feel that ultimately the collective nature of it was the hardest thing because it just didn't fit anywhere.
Right.
And there were other undercurrents, but I think we were so committed to that group covenant as a symbol of not being the regular patriarchal, hierarchical way of being called into ministry. I mean, that was the only way I was going to be ordained. I didn't want to be set over and above, you know, special thing. You know, it was.
It was our feminist theology that liberation theologies that informed that.
It really was.
Yeah, and ministry that arises in the midst of community, rather than, like Jody said, the hierarchy of us, you know, one person over others. And it really worked for us that way. I mean, it was a very motivating and for us theologically sound way to proceed.
I mean, I really think it brought us back into Christianity and into the church in a time when everything was in upheaval. And a lot of feminists were just rejecting the church.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
So my next question, I noticed the Icorns, they were very much involved and seemed to be real supporters, you know, throughout the whole process. I just keep seeing those names pop up over and over. Can you tell me more about that and their involvement?
So Bill Icorn at that time was the minister at Mill Valley Community Church, where we were all members. That was the church that was supporting us initially, and where we held membership. Anne, to whom he's married, was not yet ordained at that time, but she had started seminaries a few years after we started seminary. And they then became co-pastors at Mill Valley, but they were both very much supportive and involved. Bill had been instrumental in Bill Johnson's ordination, in moving the association through that process. He was a strong advocate for it and a strong ally. We had been, when we were thinking about, like, where are we going to join a church at the time, we were encouraged by the then director of the Center for Women and Religion, Sally Dries, very casually said, oh, you might think about checking out Mill Valley, you know. So we wandered over to Mill Valley and found a very, very supportive pastor and community. And you know, they were just, they kept us sane, you know, and helped us negotiate. We didn't know what the hell we were doing. You know, we never requested ordination before. We didn't know what this process was, really. So they, you know, Bill especially really helped usher us through the process we had to go through step by step.
Yeah, I would say the most amazing thing about those two was they were absolutely unflappable in their commitment to us. I mean, they believed in what we were doing. They wanted to support it. They weren't afraid to be on the edge of what this represented. And like Loey said, because Bill especially had already been involved with the ordination previous with Bill, he had the knowledge of some of the resistance that would come up, but they both had this intuitive ability to guide. I would forever grateful to the two of them for that, because Loey's right. I mean, there were some moments where we just looked at each other like, are you kidding me? Whose idea was this? So yeah, they were really, and you know, deeply, I mean, both those people were, and they still are, I mean, they were just deeply spiritually grounded, which I think is what, and they brought the church along. You know, they really did. They brought that church along. I mean, those people, all of them were not standing up at the beginning, but because of their amazing connection and pastoral ability, they did that.
Yeah. Very nice. I don't know much about ordination services, so this might be sort of a dumb question, but I noticed that Loey, your dad, and Stacy's mom and Jody's dad were all at the ordination service. Is that normal? Is that typical? For an ordination service, or were all your parents supportive throughout?
Yes. It's typical that your parents would be at an ordination
Is it? Okay.
service.
I figured.
And the three that you mentioned participating, like my dad read something, I think, right? And Oliver gave Loey the charge, and all of us were weeping. Weeping so much, like a big gulp of, yeah, I'll never forget that. I just couldn't get my breath. It was just so
Amazing.
hearing.
But your mother was there too, and Stacy.
Oh yeah, my mom was there. Yeah, they were supportive.
Yeah, and my mother was there.
Yeah.
My mom and my grandmother and my brother, all three were there. I think my brother and my Nana didn't quite know what was going on.
Hey, they're great. They're great. Come on.
There.
Greek Orthodox. My mom had a terrible time with this. She had such a hard time with my lesbianism, and then I go get ordained, and I sang something in Greek, and really, she was just absolute. When we circled around at the end of the service, she was crying, but it wasn't with happiness.
Oh, man.
But she did come, and the most amazing thing about her is that all these years later, she is so supportive, and we've talked about the ordination, and she talks about how proud she was of the three of us. And she's come full circle, and for a Greek woman, married off to a man in an arranged marriage in completely closed circle in Greek Orthodox Church, that is absolutely a frickin' miracle.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, what Stacy's saying was part of the Greek Orthodox liturgy for communion when we serve communion. It was just absolutely beautiful and stunning.
Thanks, Low Bear.
So looking back on the whole process, would you change anything about it, or would you do anything differently?
Yeah. Good Lord, I don't know. Maybe we, should have come out or not. I don't know. But it was 1977, 78 was a different time than it is now.
Yep.
Well, and we were out in so many places.
Right.
It's hard to say we weren't. We ended up in the New York Times. Right?
Much more out than that.
Yeah.
I think it was a process that we had to go through. There was no other way to do it. It was organic. It just kind of evolved, and for the time, it was bold, but it just had integrity. It was authentic for us. It was how we had to do it.
Yeah.
And thank God we have Bill and Ann, and our families and our friends, and and that church.
Yeah. We were so struck, those of us who were in seminary on the West Coast, who were out, were so struck with our friends we knew in the East Coast who were so closeted. So just having chosen to go to Pacific School of Religion at the time we did was just a total gift in so many ways, not just around sexuality, but in so many ways. So we probably wouldn't have done it any differently. With the United Church of Christ loves its first things, so it often confuses me with Ann Holmes, but Ann Holmes, was the first lesbian ordained officially who was out in the process, because she was outed, but that was 4 years later than our ordination. But we were already out. in ministry. It's not that we were hiding ourselves. It's just that we chose not to share that because we were so committed to this communal piece that we were, committed to, that we aren't the official first out lesbians ordained in the United Church of Christ. So it's just this weird kind of a thing.
I wouldn't have changed anything really, because I think, as Jody said, it was a process, and it was a really wonderful process in so many. The things we learned. Oh my God! And I still think about it to this day, and I'm amazed. I'm so proud and grateful to have been with these two women. And that we did step into this, and we had the courage to do that. It wasn't not a small thing that we said yes to this, even though we didn't quite know all of which would be entailed. we still said yes with our hearts and our souls, and I'm so grateful. And like Loey said, PSR was, oh my, what an amazing time that was. Feminist theology burgeoning, inclusive language burgeoning, all these conversations with white women, women of color. It was just this time of just change and evolution, and it was the right time to do what we did, I believe. I really do.
Yeah.
I noticed there was the Article 2 that lists out the in-care process and everything that is needed, is to apply for the in-care status. And I don't know who this was, but I saw that someone in the margins had wrote like off to the side in angst, sort of. And I was like, oh, I connected with that. So I didn't know if there was a reason. It was specifically with the joint paper. So I didn't know if that was just a point of frustration for everybody, and that's what brought that about. But I kind of laughed when I saw it, because I was like,
that they made us write a whole other paper, even though we'd already each written the paper. Was that the part?
No, I had Article 2. But it wasn't I didn't know about the other papers. So I don't know at what point maybe that fell in with everything, but I didn't know. I guess the paper was a point of frustration for everybody. So
it was probably more a frustration for the Committee on Ministry than for us. Because that's the piece that they couldn't get over. How can you have collective theology? It's like, duh, who do you think wrote the Bible? One person. So it was, probably at one point they wanted us to write individual ministry papers, and we said, no, we're not going to do that. Do you remember?
Well, we each had to write an ordination paper.
Yeah, we had to write our faith journey. We did that.
Yeah.
Our individual faith journeys. But then the theology of ministry we wrote together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't remember writing an individual ordination paper. I remember that they wanted that, and we said no, that this was our paper.
Right. But you have to write your own spiritual journey, kind of.
Right, yeah.
We each did that individually.
Yeah. But I could see any point, Lindsay, at any point in the process where one of us would have written,
I'm sure.
one paper or one document.
All right, so let's see. Last question that I have. So we've already sort of touched on William Johnson being ordained in 72. Do you feel like he made the process any easier, by the time 78 came around, or was it totally a different sort of thing? I know it's not, the joint ordination versus, single was, obviously different that way, but any other thoughts on that?
my own thought about that would be to say yes, in the sense of in those intervening years between his ordination, the process of his ordination, and ours, the Committee on Ministry and the conference did a hell of a lot of work as to what is it we are to do when people come before us requesting ordination, and what are the factors that are and are not qualifying or disqualifying factors. And that, that Committee on Ministry process clearly was at the point, unlike many others throughout, the church, the UCC, that said, no, one sexuality of the candidate is not a disqualifying or qualifying thing. So they behaved themselves on that thing. They were not going to bring this up unless we brought it up. And that was in large part what happened after, through Bill's ordination and the years following. They really did their work. But then we threw this new thing at him.
Yeah, I definitely think, I think what Bill's ordination process did was that it created the larger context for conversation and nuance that needed to enter into the UCC. I mean, I think if we had hit them and nothing like that had happened, I think it would have been harder. I don't know how much harder, but I think it would have been harder. It wasn't a completely new thing to them. That at least someone gay came forward. It is, I think, Jody mentioned earlier, I think it's the collective thing that in some ways threw them the most. But his stepping forward like that opened, it's like a field, opening that made other things possible. And I think that's why so many of us are still so grateful to him for that, because it was a big deal what he did.
Can I ask a couple of questions, Lindsay?
That was my last one that I had written down. So.
A couple of things. This is great conversation, and so this is really rich. But you mentioned early on the process from 5 to 3. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Maybe if we can hash it out now, and we don't have to decide what's going to be. You can still decide later. We don't want this to be public, or what you want to be public. But if you want to talk a bit about starting at 5 and going down to 3, and your reflections about that and your experience of that.
Okay, I'm not starting
I
out.
haven't thought about this. Go ahead, Loey. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jody.
Oh, I'm going to be very brief because I haven't thought about this, for so long. So it's really dredging up something way in the back corners. But I remember feeling hurt and disappointed and really quite upset at the time. I think mostly because there wasn't a lot of communication about it. My memory is that she just left and moved.
Cherry? Are you talking about Cherry?
No, that Susan. Yeah, Cherry in my mind is clouded because of what happened with her later. It's just like whatever. But yeah, it was kind of like, darn it, this is
right.
What we're trying to say and to be and do together is now not really ruined, but tainted and not made as pure because of that, in a way. And that's all I'll say about it, because I don't really, it's not very cogent.
Yeah. I think that's helpful, Jody. I think with Cherry, I think there was an initial excitement or whatever about this idea we came up with, probably in the middle of a class or something, who knows, and starting to talk, but we all were members over there. Weren't we all members at Mill Valley? I think so. And with Cherry, I think it was more of, she wasn't sure she wanted to go into ministry. I think she was deeply ambiguous about that and chose then to, go her own way. With Susan, I think she, frankly got scared that we were going to be outed, that it wouldn't happen. She was not lesbian, and that she wouldn't get ordained then. And she secured a call to a church in a different conference and just went that way. But I think you're right, Jody. There was a real lack of communication on her part with us about where she was, what she was doing. We would have supported her to do that, I think, but it was just kind of just went off on her own, and there we were.
It's interesting because I actually shared a house with different people, and Cherry was one of the participants. And what I remember about Cherry, now I'm just like Jody said, this is dredging it up. But what I remember is that she had a critique that we weren't political enough, socially political enough for her. I think she, because I think she identified as a Marxist. I mean, communism, I think, was big in her vocabulary, as I recall, and we just weren't close. That wasn't what we were doing, right? So she, I think, on some level, it was that kind of a political decision, and that was very hard because Cherry later on took her life, and we all wondered what in the heck happened to her. I mean, it was a painful story with her. Susan, I agree with Loey. I think what happened really was she had a calling in Oregon, and she was terrified that if she went with us, that she would be called to the ministry in that role. And she definitely, I think, really had a lot of issues about the fact that the three of us were lesbian and she was the only straight woman. And the interesting thing about that for us was we thought that was her presence was so positive because of that, because it wasn't making a statement about lesbianism per se, that we were heterosexual, and lesbian to me really was a foundational piece. And then she just took off. Mm-hmm. That's what happened. And it was very sad to all of us. Bill Icorn was just crushed. I mean, he was so disappointed. I think I remember we were at Asilomar when he had a conversation with her. That was difficult. I mean, he wasn't accusing her of anything. He was just saying, please help me understand this. Why are you doing this? I mean, don't you understand what an impact this is going to have? And she was immovable.
Yeah.
So sad. But we persevered. Three of us.
Right. And, I'm the one who was the reason it took kind of as long as it did, because I really struggled to find a call finally. And Jody and Stacy, had secured their calls, and then there was Loey waiting to find a place to do ministry. So, but it finally happened, but it wasn't for, a year after our initial request.
Yeah.
At that time, you could not be ordained pending a call. You had to have the call. So.
Actually, one last question. I'm going to switch gears totally. I know from research with Mary Hunt and whatever that the 70s in the Bay Area was sort of the launching of feminism in many ways. The Women's Center at the GTU, there was so much happening, and there was just this flourishing of new feminist ideas and theory and things that were going on. And what I was struck by in your papers is that here was a time to put that theory into practice. Mm-hmm. That was just, there was all this conversation and theory and talking about feminist principles and feminist ideas, but you were actually trying to take that and do something. And so you had the support of a lot of people in that community. I just love to hear any reflections about what that was like, how you experienced that, what you heard from your colleagues.
It's a great question.
I, as as the one of the three of us who has, you know, stayed active in ministry all these years, in the ways that I did, you know, I'm now the president of the PSR Alumni Council, and Mike Bausch was the previous one. So he and I have had a lot of conversations. And Mike and Kathy Carlson, his spouse, Kathy, took part in the service. You know, it just reminded me of what that meant to them, what our ordination meant to he and Kathy at the time it did. And I have heard that time and time again from other people who were there, whether it's Carolyn Roberts or whomever. It's just like this, it was a celebration of something new, something exciting, that said something about the nature of ministry that really hit a deep place in a lot of people, I think. That's what I have heard, you know, over the years.
I just feel like we were fish swimming in that water, and so it's hard to even know at the time. It was just a natural consequence of what our beliefs were. And we were just putting into practice, like you said, Mark. It's a good observation that, you know, we were able to do that right away. And having not really been in church ministry since the late 80s, I don't, and I'm not in the same world that Loey was in, so I don't really have too much of a feeling about how that, you know, what a mark that made.
Mm-hmm.
I remember, Loey, when you sent out, when you posted an anniversary
Oh, yeah.
of our ordination.
Oh yeah, Facebook.
Right. And all these people wrote in. I mean, there was just like comment after comment of people who remembered it, how much it touched them, what it did in their lives. I mean, I was like, wow, this was really, I mean, this really did. Yeah, I mean, it was, I mean, just this outpouring of love and appreciation. That's the thing I really got, was just all the gratitude people had for what we did. So that felt, yeah, it felt pretty wonderful to read all that. And thank you for posting it, Loey.
Yeah.
Good. Rich conversation. Thank you so much. You have any